lecture series in general surgery. Today is the 19th series, and we have Dr. Manish Shah and Dr. Heman Kulkarni who will be chairing the sessions. Dr. Manish Shah is laparoscopic and general surgery at Rishabh Nursing Home, Borivali West, and Nama Hospital and Karuna Hospital. Our second chairperson is Dr. Heman Kulkarni. He is an ex-associate professor of KEM Hospital and was a surgical unit of his own, now consulting general GI and laparoscopic surgeon. Speakers for the day are Dr. Dhyanesh Belekar, Dr. Aparna Deshpande, and Dr. Akash Shukla. I would request Dr. Niranjan Agarwal to say a few words before Dr. Manish and Dr. Heman Kulkarni introduce the speakers. Dr. Niranjan Agarwal.
Very warm good evening to all of you on this Friday. As Rajesh mentioned, this is the 19th series, 21 more to come up. We are already in the mid-gut right now, and the rest of the gut and the rest of the portions below the umbilicus to be covered after this. The thoracic portions and the neck, everything has already been covered. Skin, soft tissue has been covered. All these recordings are there on the MSS website as well as the YouTube channel and the YouTube channel of Juventus also. So people, those who have missed, you can spread the word that they can still go back and listen to this. Especially, we had some very interesting talks in the last few weeks, and I really wonder why people would have missed, because even the faculties were very well known in their those particular subjects. So doesn't matter. The things are still recorded and they are available with us. So you can go and have a look at them. And I'm sure even today's talks are going to be very interesting. These are subjects which are never covered again after we have passed our MS. We just take those things for granted. And I'm sure Aparna, along with Dhyanesh and Dr. Akash Shukla, are going to enlighten us on what is the latest in all this subject which they are going to talk about. Over to the two chairpersons, and 25 minutes should be the talk time, 5 minutes should be allowed for discussion. The attendees can put their question in the chat. The chairpersons are requested to stir the discussion so that any doubts which are remaining should be cleared before we log out today evening. Thank you, Rajesh, and thank you, Juventus.
Thank you, Niranjan. I would request the chairperson to introduce the first speaker, and then we start the session.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh, and thank you, Dr. Niranjan. It is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for today's session. He is Dr. Dhyanesh Belekar. He is the professor and HOD General Surgery at Terna College and Hospital, Nehru West, Navi Mumbai. He is very well-known teacher, and I am sure we will all benefit from his talk today on feeding stoma. Over to Dr. Belekar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manish, for the kind introduction. First and foremost, I would like to thank MSS for giving me the opportunity. Special thanks to the President, Dr. Niranjan Agarwal, and Secretary, Dr. Rajesh Yadav, for inviting me for giving this talk. I will share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So good evening to all. Today's topic is feeding stoma. This is a very simple and yet very comprehensive topic, and which is very close to every surgeon who has done various emergencies and handled many patients. So we will, as the PGs are also attending the sessions, I will start with the basics. What is stoma and what are the different types, and then we will move on to the two main types, that is feeding gastrostomy and feeding jejunostomy. So these are the points which I will be covering in this my session of around 25 minutes, covering important points. So what is stoma? It is defined as an artificial opening created in any part of intestine in order to divert the flatus and feces to the exterior, where it can be collected within an external device or an appliance. Now, this is a general definition. Now, when this aperture or opening is used for the purpose of achieving nutritional requirement of the surgical patient, we call it as a feeding stoma. Two main common stomas which we encounter are feeding gastrostomy and feeding jejunostomy. So what is gastrostomy? It is defined as a surgical procedure in which an opening is made in stomach, usually connecting the stomach to the exterior abdominal wall so that the feeding or decompression tube can be passed within the stomach. Jejunostomy, it is defined as a surgical procedure in which an opening is made in jejunum which is connected to abdominal wall for feeding purposes. As many of you must be aware, enteral route is preferred over the parenteral route for better recovery of patients, which is also very cost effective. Common indications for doing the procedures of feeding are neurological swallowing disorders like cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, esophageal strictures or atresia, esophageal malignancy, gastric outlet obstruction or some small intestinal obstruction, major neck surgeries, any condition which needs prolonged tube feeding for more than 4 weeks duration. There are few contraindications such as uncorrectable coagulopathy or thrombocytopenia, active gastritis, active peptic ulcer disease, history of subtotal gastrectomy, severe ascites, and patient with severe peritonitis. So start with feeding gastrostomy. I will start with some history as the feeding gastrostomy has evolved. Initially, simple open temporary procedure was done, which was then sort of converted into open and permanent variety. Then later on, PEG, which is percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, was introduced. Then PRG, that is a radiological approach, was also introduced. And latest is a laparoscopic gastrostomy. This is a brief about the history. Ekberg was the first person to suggest a gastrostomy for the purpose of achieving nutrition in surgically ill patients. In 1849, Sedelot from Strasbourg performed first human gastrostomy. In 1869, Morey was the first American to do the procedure. In 1870, first scientific paper of a case series of 9 patients were reported in literature. Unfortunately, all died. In 1876, Verneuil performed first successful gastrostomy. Patient survived. In 1880, Staton was the first American to successfully do it. Then in 91, Witzel introduced his modification. Then in 94, there was Stamp's modification. And in 1900, Janave's modification. Now, depending on the axis or approach we take, the feeding gastrostomy is classified into open, endoscopic, radiological, and laparoscopic. Open, again, two common varieties, Stamps and Janave. Endoscopic is PEG, radiological is PRG, and laparoscopic. Depending on the duration for which it is required, sometimes it is a short time or temporary one, and sometimes in a chronic debilitated terminally ill patient, it is a permanent one. Now there are certain pre-op preparations one needs to ensure, such as all basic investigations, pre-op upper GI-scopy. Sometimes if the ogidoscopy is not possible, at least a barium swallow or barium meal, X-ray abdomen and pelvis to rule out any obstruction, basic baseline ECG, of course the written informed and valid consent from the patient and the relatives, proper pre-anesthesia checkup and fitness, and proper positioning and the skin preparation. The procedure is that way simple. Incision is planned, small upper midline or a subcostal one. Peritoneal cavity is entered in layers. Stomach is identified and held in two Babcock's forceps and drawn on surface through the incision. Small incision is made on stomach so as to enter 14 or 16 French Foley's catheter within the stomach, and after its insertion, balloon is inflated and it is hitched to the skin surface to prevent any leakage. Now, two methods are adopted to prevent the leakage as follows: Stamps 1 and Genovese method. Stamps method. Here, two concentric purse string sutures are placed with non-absorbable suture material 1 centimeter apart from the catheter and are tightened one after the other, which then invaginates the tube within the stomach and secures it. Genovese method. A valve is created by burying a segment of catheter in small stomach tunnel. Tube is brought out through a skin stab incision and hitched to skin with interrupted sutures. This is a diagram which is showing in profile how a feeding gastrostomy will look when secured with the abdomen. Post-operatively, what is important is test feeds. Now, test feeds are given in propped up positions. If test feeds are tolerated, then the half feeds are given. When patient tolerates half feeds, then the full feeds can be initiated. Special formula feeds are given as per the need of the individual patient. Strict hygiene is maintained all throughout. Proper dressing needs to be done around the stoma. Relatives need to be educated about the feeds and the tube care. Nursing cares to think about with all the tubes what is important. So the supporting staff is also very crucial. So the flushing one, such as use of bottled water, Seltzer water if sluggish. Then what volume do you flush with? Usually 2 to 3 ml of gastrostomy tube after medicines or feeds are given. 5 ml 4 quarterly in the jejunostomy port or GJ tube given, even if feeding is infusing, that is given slowly. Now, there is no need to every time flush before and after, but sometimes it is required after giving the medicines. Use 5 ml syringe or greater when flushing, so less negative pressure on the tube is achieved. Now, when we are taking care, also we need to take care of the venting and the gravity help. Venting is required, allows stomach to be vented or burped, can be done before, during, or after the feeds, but it is important. If stomach contents come up, typically allows content to return into the stomach later on. Gravity allows stomach to drain. Similar to a decompression of a stomach, may require fluid replacement of contents that are secreted. Medicines are given by gastrostomy tube and both jejunostomy tubes. Usually, medicines are preferred in a liquid format than capsules or pills because pills need to be given in a crushed format for better tolerance. Flushing is encouraged before and after medicines are given. How to take care of the site? We need to clean the stoma site with soap and water daily. This is mainly useful for patients who are at home and the relatives are taking care. So we need to educate them. Check the access sites for redness, any drainage, bleeding, or any granulation tissue. Sometimes diaper creams can be used. If any fungal anticipation, then nystatin cream is given. However, need medical orders or medical supervision. stoma adhesive powder can be sprinkled at the site. May use a pronate to secure the tube for better gripping and avoiding any leakage. Now the PG was introduced, as you are aware, and there are various techniques which are introduced by various scientists and surgeons. Initially, Godrer and Ponsky in 1980 introduced the pull technique. So what was done? Endoscope was passed in the stomach, then the light was thrown and it was brought to the anterior abdominal wall. Then a small incision was made by creating a dark room, and slowly the catheter was introduced and it was pulled within the stomach lumen, and it was then later on pulled up and pulled in the esophagus and hitched. Then there is a push technique which was developed by Sachs in 1983. Then Russell in 1984 introduced the introducer technique, which is similar to a push technique. Ershaw in 1981 introduced radiological PEG, or what we call as PRG rather, and Edelman and Unger latest introduced laparoscopic gastrostomy. This is what usually PG is done under endoscopic guidance. With endoscope, one can really ensure correct placement and securing of the PG tube in the stomach so as to prevent any displacement or any leakage post procedures. This is a profile view of a PG in situ, showing for simplicity the external adapter, tubing clamp, external and internal cushions or bumpers, mushroom catheter tip. This is a modern PVC made feeding gastrostomy tube which can be introduced, which is a smaller version. Now there can be various complications that can encounter with a feeding procedure, feeding gastrostomy. Minor ones such as wound infections, tube dislodgement, ileus, fever, aspiration, leaks, small hematomas. Patient may develop anorexia and sometimes tube migration. Related to the feeds, one can encounter following complications. Mechanical one, gastrointestinal motility, metabolic, infectious, general like nausea and vomiting, and refeeding syndromes. So feed needs to be calibrated with the help of nutritionist, and it is very important that you give formula feeds correctly for the individual patient. Major complications such as gastric perforation, gastric bleeds, large hematoma, aspiration pneumonia, peritonitis, sepsis, and unfortunate death can occur. Very, very rare is a colocutaneous fistula and squamous cell carcinoma at the site of PEG, as per the literature report. Patients are monitored with electrolytes, RFT, their weight, input outputs, vital sign, pattern of their stool formation, and abdominal examination. Now these all monitoring needs to be done at regular intervals for the individual patient. So in summary, for the feeding gastrostomy topic, open technique is used for parenteral nutrition, but open technique is basically the technique of choice for all these enteral routes what we usually encounter. However, with the advent of laparoscopy, it is considered as a better one statistically. PEG is a better technique for enteral nutrition when patient is not fit for open. PEG is certainly better than the open. PRG is, as per the new studies that are coming up, PRG is better than the PEG when endoscopy is not possible in an individual patient. I will now move on to the feeding jejunostomy. Indications are more or less similar. A brief look at the history. Bush in 1858 first performed a successful feeding jejunostomy procedure in a patient of inoperable gastric cancer. Witzel in 1891 created currently most commonly used technique of feeding jejunostomy. Delaney in 1973 developed the needle insertion method. In 1980, PEG was introduced, and in 1990, laparoscopic feeding jejunostomy technique was introduced. Types, again, as I have already mentioned, open, needle, PEG, PRJ, and sometimes extension through the existing PEG. So PEG converted to PEJ, and the laparoscopic jejunostomy. Method: a subserosal tunnel is created at a site 40 centimeter distal from the ligament of Treitz. Tip of the tube or needle is to be directed in the jejunal lumen. The direction should be with the peristalsis and not against it. Tube is inserted and it's buried in a seromuscular layer for a distance of around 8 to 10 centimeters. The loop of the intestine is fixed with the parietal peritoneum, from where the tube or the needle is taken out on the skin surface. This is a picture giving you a glimpse of what we do in a feeding jejunostomy, where the tube is placed inside and the loop of jejunum fixed with the parietal peritoneum. This is another method telling in detail what we are doing step by step by introducing. Now here mainly the needle is introduced. This is another picture where it is hand assisted laparoscopic feeding jejunostomy. One can see a port where the lumen of the entire jejunum open when the loop of the jejunum is brought out, and then the tube is withdrawn from the opening which is made, and the inside the fixation of the jejunum happened with the parietal peritoneum. So these are the techniques for laparoscopic jejunostomy. One can do a schematic line diagram which is depicting how one can actually fix the jejunum, put a tube inside, and achieve a good feeding jejunostomy. This is actually a picture when a individual surgeon is performing or making an opening into the jejunum and the tube is being inserted inside. This is the end result of the exterior view of the feeding jejunostomy. Now, what are the advantages of jejunostomy? There is very minimal risk of aspiration as compared to a gastrostomy. This is beneficial in patients having pancreatitis, and it is having good role in patients who are critically ill. The disadvantages, however, are difficulty with the placement, possibility of easy displacement, feeding tolerance, slow feeding rate as compared to a feeding gastrostomy, dumping syndrome, and the formula feeds get changed. In the stomach, remember the formula feeds are different. In the jejunum, they are given in a different format. There is a change in a formula. So naturally, all the complications what we discussed for the feed related feeding gastrostomy can also be seen in this feeding jejunostomy. These are the few references for the topic of feeding gastrostomy and feeding jejunostomy. Thank you very much. I again thank MSS and the respected chairpersons for giving me opportunity to talk on this. I will be taking any questions if at all. Thank you so much.
Dr. Belekar, there are two questions on the
Yes,
chat box. One is, which tube is the best for feeding gastrostomy?
Feeding gastrostomy, usually Foveus catheter is used. Few surgeons prefer even Malakots, but a simple Foveus catheter number 18 or 16 is usually sufficient. and it can be secured very nicely, and it is easier to perform. And with the stamps method, one can secure it very easily. This is, I'm talking mainly about the open technique. One who is having advanced laparoscopic experience can certainly achieve it with a laparoscopic approach, and one who is well versed with the endoscopic techniques can go for a PEG. PEG tubes are different ones.
What about the same thing in the feeding jejunostomy? What tube would you prefer, and the
But
size
for feeding jejunostomy, we usually use a Ryle's tube. We do not use a Foley's catheter.
and the number?
Number usually 14 is sufficient, 12 or 14.
Okay.
Acha, you had talked about this formula, the different
Yes.
formulas. What is the basic difference in a gastrostomy as well as in a jejunostomy phase?
So usually the formula feeds are prepared by the nutritionist as such. But yes, there are milk formulas, special formulas, and special milk formulas. Now for a gastrostomy purpose, one can use liberally all these standard feeds without any much of a change in the composition, because that is a standard normal route when the person will anyway as such normally ingest. However, in jejunostomy, which is much farther, that formula feeds need to be further refined and they need to give them. That is the only main difference. So the nutritionist usually decides that the formula feed that are given at the jejunostomy site are not exactly same as for the feeding gastrostomy. They are slightly finer and they have more refined texture in that. So for the easy tolerance for the patient, because same feeds are given, which usually supposed to be taken at the stomach level, then there is a very high chance of intolerance by the individual patient, and then various metabolic and feed related complications one may encounter. That is why there is a slight change in the composition and the preparation of the formula feeds, which is usually guided by a trained nutritionalist who are trained for feeding purposes mainly.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Belekar.
Thank you, sir.
That was really lucid presentation, very educative, covering most of the practical aspect. Now we will move over to the second speaker. Dr. Kulkarni will introduce the second speaker.
Yeah. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Aparna, who is a professor of surgery at KM Hospital as well as St. GS Medical College. And she has been a very active in the field of laparoscopy and is considered as one of the finest laparoscopic surgeons. And she will be talking on duodenal ulcer perforation. Over to Dr. Aparna.
Thank you, sir. I'll just start my screen sharing. Is it seen?
Yep.
Good evening, respected chairpersons and all members of MSS. Uh, to talk on a topic which this audience deals with on a day-to-day basis is itself is a challenge, and I thank MSS to having given me this opportunity to talk on the duodenal ulcer perforation. Uh, as we know, peptic ulcer disease is pretty common in the general population, and the addition of increasing Helicobacter pylori infection with increase in alcohol and smoking has definitely changed the epidemiology of this disease. However, as Dr. Hemant mentioned earlier, due to good medical management, there is a significant reduction in complicated peptic ulcer disease over the last 30 years. So earlier, where we would have probably a couple of peptic ulcer perforations every day, we now see something like one or two duodenal perforations in a week, which also is a substantial part of our emergency management. And the incidence of obstruction due to peptic ulcer disease has gone down substantially, but perforations and hemorrhage are still seen. Though as surgeons we deal more with perforations, the incidence of hemorrhage outstrips perforation by 6:1. Uh, there is a definite mortality which is associated with peptic ulcer perforations, and it is one of the most common indication for emergency surgery. In 1929, Selin Jones described the omental patch technique of peptic ulcer perforation, which we are using nowadays, which was later modified by Roscoe Graham, which included a primary suturing followed by a omental, pedicled omental patch. The duodenal perforations can be either free or contained. In free perforation, the patient would present with a generalized peritonitis, whereas in a contained perforation, you're going to have a patient who probably will be in a much better hemodynamic condition because of attempt of the omentum or contiguous organs to seal the perforation. We know that most of these patients will present with a generalized pain in abdomen, which is sudden in onset, and slight movement can also cause significant amount of pain. And these patients may sometimes assume a fetal position. And the classic description of duodenal perforation is the board-like rigidity, which we have learned in Bailey and Love. What is important is to understand that most of these duodenal ulcer perforations are likely to go through the classical stages of peritonitis. So in the stage 1, there is peritonism, which includes intense irritation of the peritoneum due to chemical reaction, due to the acid coming out from the perforation, causing the intense pain and the guarding and the board-like rigidity. Left untreated for a while, this is followed by peritoneal reaction with effusion or reactive ascites, which then lessens the pain to a certain extent. The guarding may actually reduce for a certain period of time, but if the perforation is not diagnosed in the early phase, the patient will then go on to diffuse peritonitis and sepsis, and in the last stage of septic shock with the Hippocratic phases that we all remember reading from Bailey and Love is likely to be encountered. The diagnosis of peptic ulcer disease there are no specific diagnostic features, but leukocytosis and a high CRP may be present. And an increased serum amylase may be associated, but again, it's a very non-specific test. Serum gastrin levels in the patients with history of recurrent ulcers to establish diagnosis of Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. But I don't think any of us is going to think of serum gastrin levels in a patient who has come to us with an acute perforation. Blood cultures are advised before starting antibiotics, but again, that becomes a little theoretical because as soon as you suspect a perforation, you would start the patient on antibiotics. And an arterial blood gas is one of the useful adjuncts which gives you the level of, it's a measure of the level of metabolic compromise that the patient already has. The diagnostic investigation is a plain radiograph done in an upright position, which would show free gas under the diaphragm. Sometimes in large perforations, you may get free gas under both domes of the diaphragm. There are other signs like regular sign or the football sign, both associated with significant amount of pneumoperitoneum. And of course, nowadays we have the CT scan and the oral contrast CT, where you can actually see the extravasation of the contrast outside the duodenal lumen. These are all helpful adjuncts for the diagnosis, and while managing these patients, primarily an assessment of the hemodynamics of the patient is important, followed by an intravenous access, Ryle's tube insertion, catheterization. All this has to be done simultaneously with the surgical opinion, the senior surgeon's opinion. Resuscitate the patient as necessary. Monitoring of the patient is important, which is followed by a definitive treatment. As far as the technique of treatment is concerned, you would, as I already discussed, there could be either a non-contained perforation or a contained perforation. In very few selected patients with contained perforation, there can be a role of conservative management, and the patients may actually get better without any surgical intervention. Whereas in a non-contained perforation, if it is a small perforation with less amount of peritoneal contamination and a generally well maintained patient, simple repair of the perforation can be done. The technical details of this we will discuss in a simple duodenal perforation. Ideally, as we all know, 3 sutures are taken. The sutures are horizontally placed so that the spinal suture line becomes perpendicular to the long axis of the duodenum. And after placing these sutures, the two corner sutures are sutured first, and then the central suture is sutured. Thereafter, you can add a pedicle domental patch to cover this suture line. So that is the technicality of closing this perforation. The important thing is to not tighten the sutures too much to cause ischemia of the duodenal tissue, neither too loose to allow leakage of bile. There are endoscopic options like clipping, endoloop, or self-expanding metal stent, which have been described in a few studies. And in major perforations, which are the crux of managing duodenal perforation, procedures like duodenostomy, Roux-en-Y duodenostomy, antrectomy, GJ, that is Billroth 2. Sometimes Whipple's has been advocated, and absolutely in bad situations, tube duodenostomy has also been advocated. In these patients, again, a self-expanding metallic stent has been described in quite a few situations. Though this appears to be a very simple flow of management of duodenal ulcer perforation, we all know that while in practice, there are certain concerns that we always face. And some of them are the non-standard presentation, where it is very difficult to be able to clinically say with certainty that the patient is going to have perforative peritonitis. Sometimes the leak is slow and the patient may come with actual right iliac fossa tenderness. Sometimes the severity of pain is less, the board-like rigidity may actually not be there. So nearly in 1/3 of the patients, the classical presentation may be missing. We also come across situations where the X-ray does not pick up the free gas under diaphragm. The patient may come very late in a state of sepsis or septic shocks. We may have difficulty in deciding at what point the resuscitation should stop and when we should go in. There are intraoperative dilemmas as to how to deal with a particular perforation. And of course, there always is, in spite of the best of care, possibility of postoperative bile leak, wound-related morbidity, wound infections, and there is a definite risk of mortality, which can range from 8 to 25% as per various studies. So how does one overcome these concerns, and what is the best way to deal with the patients of duodenal perforation? So I think it is best to go with the current guidelines that have been established. And this is the article that I'm going to refer to, which is about the World Society of Emergency Surgery guidelines that have been published in the year 2020. And these are aimed to present the state of the art regarding diagnosis and therapeutic options for optimal management of a complicated peptic ulcer. They are evidence-based, and they've used the GRADE methodology to provide recommendations, and they have summarized all the evidences present in literature. And the population that has been considered is adult population with suspected complicated peptic ulcer disease. So this is a brief chart about the GRADE methodology. I think one needs to read it carefully to understand what strong and weak recommendations are and what is the quality of evidence that they talk about. The topics that have been covered is questions regarding diagnosis, resuscitation, non-operative management, surgery. Since they talk about both perforation and hemorrhage, they are talking about angiography and embolization, which we are not going to talk about, and the antimicrobial therapy that has been recommended. So the questions regarding diagnosis is, which is the appropriate biochemical and imaging investigations that should be requested in a patient suspected to have perforative peptic ulcer. So the basic routine lab tests and arterial blood gas analysis are the two sets of investigations that are very strongly recommended. Uh, the CTs, surprisingly, what they have found is that X-rays can miss free gas under the diaphragm up to 35 to 40% of the times, and whereas compared to CT scan, which would pick up pneumoperitoneum up to 88% of the times. So where available, the recommendation is to use a CT scan imaging. Whereas, of course, if you do not have a CT scan, and you can always go ahead with an abdominal X-ray as the initial routine diagnostic assessment. And again, what we have been taught and what we do over the years, which is injecting free air through the Riles tube in order to get a better diagnostic efficacy of the X-ray has not been mentioned in this series of guidelines. But what they say is that if the suspicion is very strong, you can add water-soluble contrast either orally or through the nasogastric tube and try to ascertain whether there is actually a leak of contrast from the gastrointestinal tract. Is there any clinical value of risk scores such as Bowie's or PULP scores? So there are various scoring systems which tells us what is the likely risk of a particular patient developing morbidity or mortality. And there is a weak recommendation that you should try and include these scoring patterns in your management of these patients. So Bowie's score has been actually described for the first time in 1982 and then validated in 1987. And they have found these three factors: medical comorbidities, preoperative shock, duration more than 48 hours, as a significant predictors of bad outcome. And then there is this peptic ulcer perforation or PULP score, which has considered about 8 variables. And again, from age to comorbidities to liver cirrhosis, steroid use, time from perforation to admission, preoperative shock, serum creatinine more than a certain level, and the ASA score. These are the various variables used by the PULS score. Of course, both of them have their own drawbacks, but it definitely would help to have some kind of an evaluation of how this patient is going to perform in the postoperative period. And what are the parameters that we have to be keenly looking at when we evaluate these patients at the casualty or in the emergency department? So what is extremely essential is to figure out whether your patient is stable or your patient is going into sepsis and organ failure. And the important thing is to identify the patients who are in sepsis and to prevent them progressing into further organ failure in order to reduce mortality. Adopting scoring systems like the SOFA or the Q-SOFA, that is a sequential organ failure assessment, that can be an additional point in order to identify whether your patient is borderline or going into sepsis, and this becomes a very important evaluation in the emergency department. So essentially you need to have the leukocytosis count, you need to have the serum creatinine level, you need to have an arterial blood gas. This apart from the clinical examination to look for tachycardia, tachypnea, any dyspnea, abdominal signs, distension, evidence of significant abdominal fluid or collection of infected fluid, and then of course and the respiratory rate, and then of course arterial blood gas to see whether the PO2 levels are low, whether there is any acidosis, what are the lactate levels. These are the various parameters that you are going to focus on while evaluating the patient. So referring to your sepsis guidelines or surviving sepsis guidelines becomes mandatory while managing these patients. Then when you start resuscitating the patient, rapid resuscitation of unstable patients to reduce mortality is very strongly recommended. In fact, it is recommended that this should happen within the first hour of presentation. And what are we trying to achieve is a mean arterial pressure more than 65 millimeters of mercury, a urine output more than 0.5 ml per kilogram per hour, and a lactate normalization. This should be strongly the target of your resuscitation. Whether you want to do an invasive hemodynamic monitoring or a non-invasive depends upon the patient's condition, but you need to optimize the fluids, and you may need vasopressor therapy in order to bring up the blood pressure in a relatively urgent manner. Serum albumin is another marker which is very strongly indicative of postoperative mortality. So low serum albumin has in various studies been identified as a very strong indicator of poor outcome in these patients. Now, which antimicrobial therapy should it be started and which to start, and what about the antifungal therapy? So essentially at the onset, administration of broad spectrum antibiotics is recommended. One should collect samples for microbiological analysis for both bacteria and fungi in all patients undergoing surgery. And antifungals need not be started as a standard therapy, but those patients who are immunocompromised, advanced stage, comorbidities, have a long ICU stay, these are the patients in whom antifungal should be considered to be given. And which antibiotics to give and for how long depends upon these factors. Depends upon whether you feel that the infection is community acquired or nosocomial, whether your patient is non-critically ill or critically ill, what is the risk of having a colonization with ESBL resistant bacteria, and whether what is your microbial and fungal growth in culture. So essentially, for a community acquired non-critically ill patient who does not have a risk of ESBL resistant bacteria, in such a patient, a simple broad spectrum amoxiclav with metronidazole or ceftriaxone or cefotaxime with metronidazole is what is being advocated. And then serially, depending upon the criticality of the patient and the ESBL resistant bacteria, you go from that to piperacillin tazobactam with metronidazole or to carbapenems if you're suspecting ESBL resistance. Depending on the fungal cultures, you will add antifungals in this patient. Now you can either give and there has to be a de-escalation. So once the patient is better, you step down on the antibiotics to prevent further antibiotic resistance. And also after 5 days, you could stop, or after, if the patient is fine, or after all your sepsis markers normalize, which could be even 7 to 10 days. Now, are there any indications for non-operative management in these patients? So there have been actually prospective randomized studies as well, which have tried to randomize patients for operative versus non-operative management, and they have found almost equal results. However, routine use of non-operative management is not recommended in a very highly selected group of patients who are extremely stable, who have no evidence of peritonitis, who do not show extravasation of contrast, and on a CT scan are the ones who would probably be considered for such management. And these are the prerequisites for managing a patient non-operatively. Radiologically undetected leak, you have to have repeated clinical examinations, repeated blood tests, you need a respiratory and venal support, resources for monitoring, and readiness to operate the patient at any point of time. What about endoscopic treatment? Now, there have been various papers which have talked about clipping these perforations or fibrin glue sealing or stenting. And in standalone case series, they have been described, they have given decent results. However, this is a weak recommendation based on the current evidences, and these cannot be recommended as a standard approach for peptic ulcer perforations, since there is going to be a lot of fibrosis around the perforation. The endoscopic clipping is one of the standard methods for iatrogenic duodenal perforations, but this specifically, the recommendation is for a peptic ulcer perforation. And now, what are the indications for surgical treatment and what is the timing for surgery? Now, these two are absolute no-brainers. So, in patients with perforated peptic ulcer with significant pneumoperitoneum or extraluminal contrast extravasation or signs of peritonitis, operative treatment is strongly recommended. I think there will be no argument about this whatsoever. And second and very important thing is that performing the surgery should be as early as possible, especially in patients with delayed presentation and patients who are older than 70 years old. What is the most appropriate surgical approach? Can you perform a laparoscopic procedure for these patients, or it has to be an open procedure? So again, essentially, a large number of studies are available where retrospectively, prospectively, open versus laparoscopic suturing has been compared. Even a prospective randomized trial is available. And what has been found, obviously, all high-risk patients are excluded. So there are strong biases in these studies. But in stable patients with perforated ulcers, if you have the facility and the skills for suturing the duodenal ulcer in an emergency setting, you can definitely provide this approach for the patient, because there are definite advantages like no postoperative pain, early recovery, so on and so forth, of all laparoscopy related advantages for these patients. However, The problems of hypercarbia, which are all CVS related morbidities, definitely exist, and hence in unstable patients who are hemodynamically borderline, who are probably going into sepsis, in such patients, open surgery is the strong recommendation as far as these guidelines are concerned. Now, there are again studies, we have mentioned sutureless repair. What is sutureless repair? Is that you either do a laparotomy or a laparoscopy, and most of these are done with laparoscopy, where fibrin glue is used to plug the suture, plug the perforation, or omentum is plugged and fibrin glue is used instead of suturing. However, again, these are highly biased studies, and based on the available literature, definitely not something that is recommended as standard of care. There is no role for sutureless repair as of the current practice. For small perforation, which surgical procedure should be adopted? So for many years, I think all of us have been thinking or routinely practicing suturing followed by a pedicled omental graft onto the sutured duodenal ulcer, and we have adopted that as a standard of care. But again, there have been multiple studies which have compared the suturing versus, just suturing versus omental plugging are additional to the suturing, and there have been no differences found in the outcomes. I think this again is one of the gifts of laparoscopy, because essentially it just means a lot more suturing if you're doing a primary suturing and then you're putting an omental patch on it, and it has been found that it doesn't give any additional benefit. Something like appendicular stump, where earlier we used to all swear by burying the appendicular stump, and now hardly anybody buries the appendicular stump, even in open appendicectomy, I think. So it is one of the kind of modifications that we have adopted to adapt ourselves to laparoscopy. So essentially, with omentum, without omentum, not much difference for small perforations less than 2 centimeters. However, there are again various studies where purely omental suturing into the or plugging into the perforation has worked much better than primary suturing in larger perforations. So omental patch is not totally given up, but for small perforations, it is something that can be done away with. So these are the standard technical pictures that we normally do in duodenal ulcer perforation. And now the thing that really bothers all of us, because all this is nice and fine when the patient has a small perforation, so obviously the if he comes in time, the contamination is less, the patient generally does well, you can do any type of suturing, mostly the patient will be fine, there will be no leak. However, when there is a large perforation more than 2 centimeters, then what is the surgical procedure that should be adopted? And it is recommended that a tailored approach should be uh, uh, given to the patient based upon the location of the ulcer. Obviously, for gastric perforations, a wide resection is advocated, because we are always want to rule out malignancy in these patients. And in large duodenal ulcers, again, resections or repair plus minus pyloric exclusion, external bile drainage, depending upon the condition of the patient. It is obviously very common sense that the larger the ulcer perforation, the more the amount of contamination, and most of these patients are not in a condition to undergo major resectional surgeries. So most of the times the patients will have to undergo damage control or minimal surgeries. So a duodenostomy or a pyloric exclusion with gastrostomy, these are the options that you may have to give the patient. Duodenostomy, Roux-en-Y duodenostomy, Billroth 2, these are all options which become difficult to exercise in this set of patients. And hence a lot of unconventional procedures have also been described, like serosal patch, gallbladder patch, and tube duodenostomies, which can be used for such patients. This is one of the experience that we had shared at ASICON 2016, where a combined duodenostomy, a reverse and a feeding jejunostomy for complex duodenal perforations was performed. So the perforation was sutured primarily, a separate T-tube duodenostomy and a reverse jejunostomy to drain all the bile from the duodenum, and a feeding jejunostomy. And the bile drained here would be fed through the jejunostomy. And these were about 3 to 5 patients over a period of time, and all of them did well. The perforations closed over 6 to 8 weeks. So this was the kind of perforation. One of them was endoscopic, ERCP induced. The rest were duodenal ulcers, and a T2 would show a properly healed ulcer after a month or so. So essentially, the large duodenal ulcers are the ones that give us a lot of problem. And then is there any role for damage control surgery in these patients? So if the patient is in deep septic shock from a perforated peptic ulcer with severe physiological derangement, a damage control surgery can be offered. Now this can either be done with source control. That means you do a laparotomy, give lavage, and then keep an open abdomen, which is what actually damage control is like. So there is actually a study which is going on, which all of you are welcome to look up. It's an international study, and they are even encouraging enrollments. So this is closed or open after laparotomy study in cases of duodenal ulcer perforations. And after reading all this, what I found surprising is that we have been using drains under local anesthesia when such patients present in septic shock, and then normalize the parameters to a certain extent, and then you go in and actually get a source control. So this is drains without immediate source control, get some drainage of the peritoneal fluid, and then go and do the suturing. Unfortunately, neither have we published this, and this is not discussed in literature, definitely not discussed in the guidelines that we have just now gone through. So there are a lot of thoughts that I would like to leave this. Uh, in spite of the fact that we deal with peptic ulcer perforation very commonly, we do not have any registries, we do not have any large studies coming out. And I think there are these simple things that we do, like pushing air through the rice tube, or putting drains under local, or various other small management issues, but it never comes up. So I would just like to put this to Rajesh and Niranjan as MSS office bearers. If you want to do something about it, we will be most happy as an institution to collaborate and take something ahead from here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aparna. That was an excellent presentation, especially with the review of literature, and it is evidence-based. So I think it is more scientific also. Now, I think there are few questions which have come, out of which, they have actually been discussed, but still I would like, that what will be the role of a large, can they be plugged using a Ryle's tube? There is one question saying that large perforations can be plugged using a Ryle's tube, to which omentum is tied using a vicryl, and omentum is pulled into the cavity, plugging the perforation, and interrupted sutures can be taken. So what is your take on this?
So, sir, endoscopically, this has been actually, it has been published in literature in a combined endoscopic laparoscopic way of managing. So you go endoscopically and pull in the omentum, and then laparoscopically just place the drain. So this is an idea which has been kind of executed. This is a modification that on table you get the Ryle's tube out, and an excellent idea, but I just hope that we get all this published, so that all these various ways, these are all damage control modes, and every surgeon has his or her own different way of dealing with these problems. Unfortunately, they never get discussed as a on any platform. So I think they need to be discussed, and they can be evaluated, certainly.
Yeah, there is another question regarding the any preference for the type of sutures to close the perforation.
As in,
For closing the normal perforation, say a smaller perforation. So
yeah.
what suture material is to be used?
Suture material. So I think what we have been using is Mersilk for ages, at least. I think I have not done a DUP in ages, so I have been using Mersilk. I don't know what currently the students are using.
No. I guess still it's Mersilk only.
PDS or Mersilk, both would be perfectly fine. And as I said, the technique is more important, because you need to know that you have to tie the corners first, so that the there is release of pressure from the edges,
Yes.
and then tie the center so that you
Yes.
don't tie the perforation under any kind of a tension.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think no other questions. So
No, there
I
is one
think-
more question,
Hmm.
Dr. Kulkarni.
Yeah.
There can closure of perforation in a relatively less contaminated case be combined with GJ vagotomy as a definitive procedure?
See, if this question was 25 years back or 30 years back, one would have said yes. There used to be a lot of debate of this issue when we were residents. And for accomplished surgeons, I think it was being discussed that how 7 or 8 vagotomies were done in stable patients. Yes, it can. But with the current availability of excellent medical management for duodenal ulcers and gastric ulcers, it is not something that is desirable because you are extending the operative time for the patient, and it is not really necessary because the patient is going to be fine with medical management later on. You are going to eradicate the H. pylori and going to put the patient on surveillance.
So the role of vagotomy is almost given up now.
Given up, and GJ has its own problems. So doing a loop
Yeah.
GJ for a young patient is not without its problems. The patient can be miserable with biliary gastritis. So you need to do a Roux-en-Y GJ, which again means extended time. So it's not something that I would recommend, certainly.
Yeah. Now, just last question. You know that recommendations which were given. Now, are these recommendations being seriously followed in a institutional level?
Sir,
Like,
I think
to do a contrast study and all those things, CT scan and all.
so. Precisely. So that was a surprise for me also, because we generally go by X-ray, and when we see gas under the diaphragm,
Yes.
we will scold the residents for doing a CT scan, frankly.
Yes,
So
yes.
that is the way we have been taught, and we deal with the condition. But what the percentages that they mention, that X-ray may miss it 35% of the times, and even CT may miss it 12% of the times. So then amongst the two, you are choosing a better investigation. You are also getting more information from that investigation.
Right. Right.
And to be truthful to you, many of the times nowadays patients come to us pretty late. So we need to know how much contamination, how many pockets of collections are there, and most of these patients already have the CT by the time either they
Yes.
come to us or they're reported to us.
Yeah. Thank you, Aparna, for such a nice presentation. I think
Thank you.
we'll now go over to
Thank you, Rajesh, Niranjan.
Yeah, thank you
Dr.
so much.
Manish
Dr.
for introduction of the third speaker.
Our next speaker is Dr. Akash Shukla. He is HOD Gastroenterology at KM Hospital. He is attached to Global Hospital Parel as a senior consultant hepatologist. His talk is on evaluation of and management of upper GI bleeding. Again, very interesting topic. Over to Dr. Akash.
Good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
evening.
Are my slides visible?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, your slides are also visible.
Thank you so much. At the outside, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this August gathering. I have been fortunate to have trained under some fantastic surgeons, and now getting to work with many of my teachers and colleague surgeons who are par excellence. So today I am going to speak on approach to a patient with upper GI bleed. I am not going to talk of surgical approaches because I'm not a surgeon, but I'll keep my talk simple for everybody as to what we actually do when a patient comes to us with an upper GI bleed. We know that upper GI bleed can present in three forms: hematemesis, that is vomiting of blood; melena, that is black tarry stools with a strong offensive smell; and hematochezia, which is the passage of bright red blood from the anus. Now, why some patients with the upper GI bleed may have hematochezia? That is because the bleeding is very brisk, and if the colonic transit time is less than 6 hours for the blood, that means from the bleeding till coming out from the anus, if the blood has stayed in the gut for less than 6 hours, it won't turn melenic, and therefore the patient will develop hematochezia. So it depends on the volume of the blood and also on the transit time in the gut. Similarly, if the blood is at least 80 ml, patient will develop melena. If the quantity of bleeding is less than 80 ml, they usually will present with occult upper GI bleed. Remember that both melena and hematochezia can be caused by upper GI bleed or lower GI bleed. So a right colonic bleed, if it stays in the colon for 6 to 8 hours, can become melenic. Very often we are asked, what are the common causes of upper GI bleed? So these are the 11 commonest causes of upper GI bleed. They could be erosive or inflammatory. We have just heard peptic ulcer disease. Similarly, esophagitis and erosions in the stomach or the duodenum. Amongst the vascular causes, variceal, gastric antral vascular ectasias, Dieulafoy's lesions, and angiodysplasias. Malignancies like esophageal and gastric malignancies, and traumatic like Mallory-Weiss tear, Boerhaave syndrome, post-surgical, and rarely aortoenteric fistulae. We always take the history when a patient comes about what are the predisposing factors for upper GI bleed, because they may give us a clue. So we always take the history of drugs like aspirin, NSAIDs, or anticoagulants, history of alcohol consumption or smoking, which will predispose to a peptic ulcer bleed, history of burns for Curling's ulcer, history of a trauma to the head for suspicion of Cushing's ulcer, history of trauma, sepsis, or any other major illness when a call comes from the ICU, which is stress ulcers. In a patient who has got chronic kidney disease or acute kidney injury, angiodysplasias or peptic ulcer disease, patients with coagulopathy, like congenital coagulopathic disorders or acquired coagulopathy, where patient may come with additional problems like bleeding gums, hematuria, and easy bruisability, any surgery for aortic aneurysm, and history of chronic pancreatitis or pseudocyst to suspect Haemosuccus pancreaticus. What particular symptoms point towards the cause of bleed? The patient has history of upper abdominal pain, burning, heartburn, then you will think of peptic ulcer, refractory heartburn, odynophagia, GERD symptoms, you'll think of esophageal ulcer, history of retching, emesis, coughing prior to hematemesis, you'll think of Mallory-Weiss tear. Patient comes with painless, large quantity bleed, you'll think of a variceal hemorrhage. Patient has history suggestive of decompensated liver disease like jaundice, ascites. Again, you'll suspect that this could be variceal, although remember that 1/3 of these could still be a peptic ulcer bleeds. Then if you have alarm red flag signs like dysphagia, early satiety, profound weight loss, cachexia, then you will suspect a malignancy. Now, can we suspect, depending on the type of vomitus or the color of the stools, as to what is the likely source of bleeding? So we group it according to the site of bleeding and whether it is a mild bleeding or a heavy bleeding. So if you have a heavy bleeding from the esophagus, then the patient will vomit out bright red blood. And if the patient gets melena, it will be again bright red blood melena. Whereas if it's a mild bleeding, they will usually have, from the esophagus, they will usually have coffee ground vomitus, or if they pass in the stools, then it will be melena, which is true for all the three causes of upper GI bleeding for mild bleeding. That is, whether it's from esophagus, stomach, or duodenum. If they have a mild bleeding, they will present with coffee ground vomitus, and they will present with melena or a combination. But if the patient has heavy bleeding and the bleeding source is esophagus, then they will present with bright red blood both in the vomitus as well as in the stools. If the patient is bleeding from the stomach, usually it will be bright red blood in the stools, and it will be a mixture of bright and dark red blood in the vomitus. If the bleeding is from the duodenum, and it's a heavy bleeding, there will be a more proportion of dark red blood and small quantities of bright red blood in the vomiters, whereas it will be a mixture of dark red blood and black blood in the stools. So this is what will give you some sort of a clue as to which is the likely source. Now, why do we often get confused sometimes? Bleeding from the upper respiratory tract, like nasal bleeds or nasopharyngeal bleeds, can be mistaken for a GI bleed because the patient may swallow the blood, and therefore he may actually vomit it out, and you may think that this is coffee ground vomitus, or the patient may pass this blood in the stools in the form of melena. Also, swallowing of hemoptysis can present as melena. Very often, we have had patients where when they come to the casualty, a Ryle's tube is put, and if the Ryle's tube does not show blood, then it is presumed that the patient is not having active bleeding, or the patient is not having hematemesis, but is hemoptysis. This is again a wrong concept. Almost 40% of patients who have an active ongoing upper GI bleed will not be showing any aspirate in the Ryle's tube of the blood. So that is why if you get blood in the Ryle's tube, you will suspect upper GI bleed, but absence of blood in the Ryle's tube does not rule out an active ongoing upper GI bleed. Careful history and examination is the key to differentiate respiratory source of bleeding from the GI ones. And I think it's almost always on the history that you'll be able to differentiate. Rarely you'll have to go to the investigations. Now, once you have confirmed that the patient has had hematemesis or an upper GI bleed, or you are suspecting an upper GI bleed, how do we initially manage this patient? You keep the patient in a mouth for the time being. 2 large bore peripheral IVs are put for possible fluid resuscitation, blood transfusion, and sample collection. You will start supplemental oxygen. The goal is to maintain a saturation of 94% for patients without COPD, and for patients with COPD, you will target a saturation of 90%. Like I said, nasogastric aspiration is not routinely recommended. For patients on dual antiplatelet therapy, continue aspirin. There is no role or evidence for use of tranexamic acid in patients with acute GI bleeding. And there is no need for routine prophylactic endotracheal intubation. You need endotracheal intubation for only those patients who have vulnerable consciousness and are likely to aspirate blood, and in case they have a massive bleeding. When I say initial management, we do not forget the ABCs. So the clearing of the airway, checking for the sensorium, looking for the breathing, and measuring the blood pressure goes without saying. So the management will always start from there. This is after that what we are going to do. What do we do in a patient who is on anticoagulant already? So in those patients who are on warfarin or heparin, you withhold the anticoagulation, and then you give either a 4-factor prothrombin complex, or you with vitamin K, or you give FFP for life-threatening GI bleeding. If the INR is less than 2.5, do not delay the endoscopy for correction of coagulation. And for those patients who require anticoagulation, as soon as the bleeding is controlled, we restart unfractionated heparin because of its short half-life, and you can discontinue whenever you want. If the patient is on the newer DOACs, like the rivaroxaban or the apixaban or dabigatran, not uncommon. We know that the duration of action of these DOACs ranges from 8 hours to 24 hours. And therefore, it will be difficult to reverse the toxicity of these agents for this period of time, unless you have specific antibodies, which are monoclonal antibodies like the idarucizumab for dabigatran and anti-Zaxanet alpha for rivaroxaban, apixaban, and endoxaban. So these are now becoming available gradually, and hopefully in the next few months, we should have both these molecules freely available, although cost will remain extremely high. If the patient has come to us within the 3 hours of consuming the dose, we can give activated charcoal because that tends to absorb these DOACs and therefore reduces the absorption of these DOACs. What are the initial medications that we give? So for resuscitation, we give anything that is not hypotonic. So I think that is the key. People often ask, which is the best fluid to resuscitate? Is it normal saline? Is it Ringer's lactate? Or is it plasma light? Anything that is not hypovolumic. So no D5, no D10. Use isotonic crystalloid. Use and give in 5,000 to 500 to 1,000 ml boluses in patients who have a compromised cardiac function. So people with ischemic heart disease, people with chronic kidney disease, elderly people, the boluses have to be smaller. We will always start a PPI infusion empirically. Ideal one is omeprazole, 80 milligrams stat, followed by a continuous infusion of 8 milligram per hour. If we are suspecting a variceal bleed, then a somatostatin analog, either a somatostatin, which is 250 microgram stat followed by 250 microgram per hour as a continuous infusion, or terlipressin, which you'll give 2 milligrams bolus followed by 1 milligram every 6th hourly, would be given. Along with that, you would start IV antibiotics, usually a 3rd generation cephalosporin for broad spectrum coverage of the usual bacteremia that tends to occur along with these variceal bleed. Whenever an endoscopy is planned, we use prokinetics like metoclopramide 20 minutes before the procedure is done. Now, one of the key things which we have to understand is how do we estimate the degree of blood loss in our patients. So we look at the vitals, the heart rate, the blood pressure, the mental status, and the urine output over a period of time. If all the parameters are very well preserved, usually the blood loss is less than 750 ml, less than 15% of the body weight, and this is class 1 blood loss. When you start getting tachycardia and orthostatic hypotension, but the other parameters are still preserved, although the patient will be usually anxious in this stage, we are dealing with class 2 blood loss, and which is 15 to 30% and 750 to 1500 in terms of absolute volume. When along with that, there is severe tachycardia, heart rate is more than 120, there is resting hypotension, the urine output is significantly low, there is severe tachypnea, and the patient starts becoming aggressive or starts becoming drowsy, then we know that we are dealing with class 3 bleeding with a volume loss estimated to be between 1500 to 2000 ml, 30 to 40% of the blood loss. And anything more severe, like very low blood pressure, less than 80 systolic, heart rate of more than 140, severe tachypnea, more than 40 per minute, usually indicating acidosis, severe acute kidney injury, patient is confused or unconscious, is more than 2 liters of blood loss, more than 40% of the volume, and this is class 4. How do we decide transfusion to be given? So in variceal bleed, for sure, we give restrictive transfusions. For low-risk patients, that is those who do not have a cardiac comorbidity, the target hemoglobin is 7 gram per cent. And therefore, if the hemoglobin is less than 7, you would give 2 units of packed cells. In high-risk patients, your target is 8 grams. And again, you'll transfuse 2 to 4 units depending on the hemoglobin. We know that 1 packed cell will increase the hemoglobin usually by around 1 grams. So you're targeting 7 to 9 in patients with majority of the cases. And in patients who have got a significant cardiac pulmonary disease, you would target eventually a hemoglobin level of around 10 grams. You can give blood packed cells even if the patient is on crystalloids. And in patients who are not responding to crystalloids, please use transfusions of packed cells for achieving hemodynamic stability. there is no role for giving empirical platelets or FFPs if these are not deranged. Platelets may be given if the platelet count is less than 50,000, and FFPs may be given if the INR is more than 2.5. Restricted transfusion policy, even in patients with non-variceal bleeding, actually is associated with better outcomes, lower mortality, less rebleed rates, lesser transfusion reactions, and lesser rate of cardiac complications. So same principle, targeting 7 or 8, depending on the different studies. I think somewhere in that range should be the right target hemoglobin for patients with GI bleeds. The next question comes, which patients can we safely send back home and call them electively? So patients who have this Rockall score of 0 or 1 or 2, these are the patients who can be sent back safely. They do not require emergency endoscopy. You look at based on the age, the blood pressure, the presence or absence of comorbidities, the diagnosis, and endoscopy findings. And you add all these scores. If the summation of all the 5 scores is less than 3, then these are the patients who carry good prognosis. And those who have a score of more than 8, they have a high risk of mortality, and those are the patients who should be managed in ICUs. Similarly, another score is the Glasgow-Blatchford score, where again, you look at the blood urea nitrogen, hemoglobin, blood pressure, heart rate, symptoms, and comorbidities. And if somebody has a score of 0, this patient can be discharged and follow up in the outpatient department and need not be admitted. Anybody who's got a score of more than 0 requires admission and would, like in all probability, require intervention. This is the most commonly used score for deciding whom to admit and whom not to admit. Next question comes, how soon do we do the endoscopy for our patients? An emergent endoscopy is done within 6 hours. This is not recommended because this is associated with worse outcomes. Today, the only patients where I do an emergent endoscopy is somebody who keeps on bleeding torrentially despite medical therapy, and we are not able to achieve any sort of hemodynamic stability despite adequate resuscitative measures. So those are the patients where I will go in because these patients will not get stabilized unless I control the bleeding. Urgent is within 12 hours and early is within 24 hours of admission. Early is what is recommended for majority of the patients because you can achieve hemodynamic stabilization, and best endoscopic facilities are usually available within 24 hours. Whereas urgent is required in patients who have got an active hemorrhage, hemodynamic instability, persistent variceal bleed, if you're suspecting an aortoenteric fistula, or in patients with in-hospital rebleeding. These are the patients where urgent endoscopy should be done, that is within 12 hours. Is it because of the endoscopist's convenience? The answer is no. The studies have actually shown that patients who undergo an emergent endoscopy actually have worse outcomes, and the outcomes are better with urgent endoscopies or early endoscopies as compared to emergent. Amongst the two, urgent and early, there is not much difference, although urgent endoscopies tend to have a slightly worse outcomes as compared to early endoscopies. But that is basically because the indications of doing an urgent endoscopy are associated with a higher mortality. There are several modalities for controlling the bleeding on endoscopy. We can inject, we can use thermal methods, which are contact methods or non-contact methods. The non-contact method is argon plasma coagulation. The contact methods, as all of you know, are the heater probes or the electrocautery probes. Mechanical methods are clips, which could be through the scope clips or over the scope clips. We had a fantastic discussion just now on duodenal perforation. We can now use these over the scope clips even for closing duodenal perforations when we identify it on table during a procedure, not for a patient who has come from the community with a duodenal perforation. Mechanical methods would also include band ligation, a scope of several procedures. On endoscopy, in a peptic ulcer, we grade into type 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 2C, and 3, what is called as the Forrest grading. If there is an active A, very high risk of rebleeding without treatment, 90%, which comes down to 15 to 30% with endoscopic therapy. And these are the patients where we will have a surgeon ready always, because if they rebleed, surgery is going to be salvaging these patients, or radiological intervention and GD embolization are available. 1B is oozing of blood, we get very good therapy outcomes with appropriate endoscopic therapy. In 2A, there are a visible vessel which is not actively bleeding, but we can see a blood vessel which is stopped. These are the patients who are very dangerous because they are not actively bleeding. We tend to fall into complacency. But these patients have a much higher rebleed rate than in somebody who has got oozing. There's a risk of 15 to 30% of rebleed, even if you treat these patients. Usually we'll apply a hemoclip and we will also inject at the base of the ulcer. But despite that, the risk of rebleeding is high. Contrary to that, adherent clot actually has got better outcomes. A flat spot in an ulcer crater is 2C, has got good outcomes, and class 3, that is a clean-based ulcer, has the best outcomes with very little risk of bleeding or rebleeding. Rebleeding risk is highest within the first 72 hours after the endoscopy. I'll not go into the complicated management of peptic ulcer based on the Forrest. The key thing to understand here is endoscopically, the combination of two modalities is better than one for Forrest 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. For Forrest 2C and 3, a single modality is actually adequate. All the patients should be on IV PPI for 72 hours, and we must eradicate their H. pylori infection once we achieve stable condition. For those who have a diffuse mucosal refractory bleeding, we can use a topical hemospray. For patients who are bleeding from a large vessel, we can use an over-the-scope clip or even band ligation. And those who continue to bleed, they can go for an embolization or surgery. Once endoscopy has been done, patient has achieved stability. For those who are high risk for rebleeding, we continue the IV PPI for 72 hours. We start on the liquid diet for almost 72 hours, and then we give solid diet. Aspirin, if required, to be started within the first 7 days only. In patients who are on intermediate risk, we can shift to twice a day oral PPI and observe in the hospital for around 24 to 48 hours after successful endoscopic hemostasis is achieved. For low risk patients, they can go on a normal diet immediately, and we can start them on oral PPI once a day and can be discharged after endoscopy has confirmed that there's very low risk for bleeding. For large ulcers, which are actively spurting, even though endoscopic hemostasis has been achieved, an angiographic embolization may be considered. So spurters, please alert your interventional radiologist, and you may consider in somebody who has got a chronic kidney disease or other comorbidities to preemptively go and block the bleeder vessel. For other non-ulcer bleeds, do we have options? For esophagitis, it is proton pump therapy and endoscopic therapy only if you have a focal ulcer with bleeding. For Deulevoy's lesion, we will usually use a thermal probe, use an injection, or we can use hemoclips or over-the-scope clips. Rarely, we will do band ligation in resource-constrained settings. For Mallory Weiss tear, if there is no active bleeding, only PPIs. But if there is active bleeding, we will use either mechanical or injectable hemostatic measures. For GAVE, in CKD or in cirrhotics, argon plasma coagulation is the preferred modality. For malignancy, it will be hemoclipping or APC or hemospray, depending on whether it is localized or diffuse, and we'll have a very low threshold for sending the patient for angiography or embolization. For hemophilia, hemosuccus, we would go for angiography and embolization as the preferred modality. For aortoenteric fistula, surgical repair or rarely interventional radiology related repair would be preferred. So you stratify your patients, do their initial assessment, ABC, admission, resuscitation, then endoscopy within 24 hours of presentation, urgent endoscopy for the selected subgroup of patients. For low risk endoscopic patients, we can discharge if they are stable within 24 to 48 hours. For the other patients who are moderate or high risk, they need to stay in the hospital beyond 72 hours and to be discharged only after we are sure that the risk of rebleeding and rehospitalization is really low. For acute variceal bleeding, after the ABC and initial resuscitation, vasoconstrictors have to be used, either somatostatin or terlipressin or octreotide, along with antibiotics and restrictive transfusion policy. Endoscopic therapy is the first line of treatment for control. For esophageal varices, band ligation is effective in more than 90%. For gastric varices, glue is usually done. And in those patients who do not respond to this, you have the option of doing a TIPS, which is basically placement of a metallic stent between the portal vein and the hepatic vein. How do you manage a patient who continues to bleed despite band ligation or glue? This happens in around 10 to 15% of acute variceal bleeds. For immediate relief, we can use a balloon tamponade, for which we can use the Sangstecken Blackmore tube or the Minnesota tube or the Linton Necklace tube, although it's difficult to find these tubes. What we use nowadays more often is something called as the Dennis LS stent, which is the esophageal self-expanding metallic stent, which is very useful, can be kept in place for up to 7 days, and then can be removed once the patient has achieved hemodynamic stability. When do we send our patient for urgent TIPS? In patients who have failed 2 sessions of endoscopic therapy, or you do a preemptive TIPS in patients who are at very high risk for rebleeding, those who are child pug C or child pug B plus active endoscopy, active bleeding on endoscopy, along with MELD of more than 18 and a transfusion requirement of more than 4 units of PEG cells. Elective TIPS is done for those patients who have late rebleeds despite being adequately endoscopically treated and being on non-selective beta blockers. For gastric varices, primary prophylaxis is usually not indicated unless they are more than 3 centimeters size and the MELD score is more than 17. In patients with acute bleeding, we use the same vasoconstrictors and antibiotics, and on endoscopy, if you get GOV1, you will treat them just like esophageal varices with band ligation or rarely with glue. But if you're dealing with IgV1 or GOV2, then glue injection is what is preferred. And then for secondary prophylaxis, you use non-selective beta blockers. But if the patient continues to bleed, then you will do either a TIPS or you do a balloon retrograde transvenous obliteration in patients who have got a favorable anatomy in the form of presence of a gastrorenal shunt, where you can go transfemorally into the gastrorenal shunt and block the afferent to the gastric varices. So, my dear friends, my take-home message: initial management is the ABC, followed by resuscitation, use of empirical PPI therapy, prokinetic before the endoscopy. In patients with suspected variceal bleed, use of somatostatin analogs like terlipressin or somatostatin, reversing the anticoagulation immediately as soon as possible, triaging the patients to decide who goes to ICU, who can be discharged, who can be managed on floor, and then planning endoscopy at the appropriate time, not to go for an emergent endoscopy, but for a early or an urgent endoscopy, choose the right sedation, identify the right bleeding source, and in case of active bleeding, use the right modality for control. If on endoscopy, high risk bleeding, then keep your interventional radiology person ready if he is available, or be ready to go in for surgical control if required. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Akash. It was an excellent presentation. As GI bleeding is quite common in our day-to-day practice, it will definitely help all general surgeons in the initial stage of management. There is one question, but that I don't understand. Any role of site of bleed related to ligament of teats?
Yeah, so basically, when you say upper GI bleed, it refers to any bleeding that is happening proximal to the ligament of Treats. So that is the definition. And any bleeding which is beyond ligament of Treats is not considered to be an upper GI bleed. So I think that is what they meant to ask.
Dr. Hemant?
Yeah. Now, I think all of us have had a really nice discussion, and the topics also were of practical importance, especially we do come across in our private practice also on day-to-day basis. Just a minute. So I think everybody, must have been very happy with the topics which have been discussed. Now, if there are no questions, I think we should conclude this session now. And just before concluding, I would definitely like to thank the organizers, especially our president, Dr. Niranjan, as well as Secretary Dr. Rajesh Yadav, who are doing such an excellent job. And they are conducting, this is the 19th series, and that has been, it has been every weekly. So the tremendous effort which they have taken, and I really appreciate that. And my heartfelt thanks to even Juventus also for conducting all this. Okay. So I think if there are, we can conclude this session now, and we'll meet again next time. Thank you.
Thank you all the chairpersons. I would request our ASI President, Dr. Abhay Dalvi, to say something before we conclude our session. So are you there?
Well, I think he's there, I think.
No, he's there, but I think he has either muted. So, yeah, anyways, thank you, Dr. Akash, for that wonderful lecture. And it has covered almost everything, and has really changed few of our concepts at today's era. Probably, I think surgeons are just probably no role, I guess, from their entire presentation, what I feel. And probably the role would be involved as when the patient is really deteriorating. But anyways, that's good for the patient, because I remember way back when you used to manage GI bleeds and how tough it would be, and the number of bloods it would require and all those stuff. So that's great. Thank you, Dr. Aparna. Thank you, Danesh. And thank you both our chairperson, Dr. Hemant and Dr. Manish. And thank you all, because you always keep us, on a short notice. I keep asking them to take lectures, and people do come and honor us. That's really very great of them. And I hope that same cooperation is expected from all of you at the future dates also. Niranjan had to leave early because of some commitment. So thank you, Juventus, for the program. And we meet on next Friday with a new lecture series. Thank you all. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Rajesh.
Very much.
Thank you to MS.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.